does. I don't see
There
it.
we, now we're
Yes, we can
recording
see
in
us.
progress. So we didn't hear her bail out, so that's good. That's fine. And without
I don't see us up
faces
here.
and voices and all those things going on at the same time, it was a little hard for me to tell.
Let's see.
All right. So there's Amy, and I see the Corrals coming on.
Oh,
And Sue Garrett is coming on, but we don't have a video yet.
Ah, I see you both.
And the Corrals are not videoed yet, which is fine. Nobody has to be videoed, but it's just nice to be able to see folks' faces.
Yeah.
So we'll wait. Here come the baits.
what about this view up
Wait
here?
for a few more minutes.
There you go. And Reverend Gary.
Hey, good to see you.
Roll.
Good to see you guys.
Good to see you.
And,
Yeah, Patty and Amato will be joining shortly.
that's fine. That's fine.
Chair. What, why don't you do?
I
chair?
think
Hmm. Hmm.
See, the speaker is supposed to have the
Full
large screen.
screen?
So
But
Fred
they're not-
and Kathy, do you have more pictures on your screen now? Did the
Yes, yes.
Yes. Very good.
Yes.
Thank you.
That's why we came on about 1:45 because I wanted to play with it, and it said, okay, it shows gallery, and then touch the button. Well, there it was, gallery. The word gallery was even by it. I didn't see it the week before, so.
Google is one of my best friends, and what I've learned over the years is that if you can ask a good question, Google can usually answer it. All those keywords, iPad, gallery view
I can't see Father Brower.
shows up. So, hey, Amaro, I see you there. Whoa! We got two screens going on. One with Amaru and one with his dad. That's cool. Hey, Matt,
Oh.
great smile.
Hey everyone. Molly's joining me. She's just putting Will down right now, so she should be down any second.
Whatever. That's fine. That's fine. We've got some time.
You see the Badgers?
Yeah, I see the Badgers.
Oh, okay. Okay.
There's
Good.
there's a way to, adjust the format of the screen.
All we can see is us.
Yep. Well, go up. I don't know what you are using, but usually it's go up to the upper right-hand corner and select gallery. Gallery, and then you'll see it.
Now on our iPad, it was on the left-hand side.
Oh, well, your iPad is special.
Yeah, I think so.
It doesn't have it on the right-hand corner. It
yeah.
says mute my video, audio, stop video, that kind of.
You're fine. As long as you can see me. What else do you?
You're lost right now.
All right.
There's too many people here.
All right. Yeah. Depending on the size of the screen that you're using, it can be a little bit challenging. So I'm going to share a screen and we're going to get going because it's 7:05 and we have videos tonight. You don't have to look at me the whole time. So think.
I see it.
Come on. Do the play thing there.
It's not what we had last week.
There we go.
We got it.
You got it. You got one screen that says Episcopal 101, learning our stories, right?
Week
Yeah.
2.
Yes.
And we see your face.
Oh, well.
We don't see your face.
Yes.
All right. Okay. So glad that everyone is here. Thank you all for coming and being part of this larger conversation. I want to make sure that we know who all is here. Sue is the one person that is here that was not here last time. And I just want to welcome her. And Sue, say if you want, if there's anything that you want to say about yourself and why you have joined this crowd and all of that, that would be wonderful to hear.
Okay, I haven't done Zoom for a long time. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, great. I'm not a cradle Episcopalian, but I joined the Episcopal Church when I was in college. And I moved here from San Diego about 11 years ago to be near my family. And I started coming to Good Shepherd last fall, and I decided this was a good place for me.
Well, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're really, really glad that you have joined us. I was in a conversation earlier today with someone, and he remarked about being, and I'm not, this is not directed at you, Sue, it's directed
Yeah.
kind of sort of more globally. He said, well, looking at the vestry, almost all of the vestry were former Roman Catholics. And so,
Yeah.
that's one of the graces of the Episcopal Church, and we'll talk more about that this evening.
Right.
But it's a grace of Good Shepherd and all of that, that we've got people coming in from all over the place. And so we're very happy to have you here, and any of you who are Roman Catholics, obviously glad to have you here. And somebody else in that conversation just said he thought that probably half of our church is former Roman Catholics. So again, not saying anything about you, Sue, but it was just sort of in the top of my mind for all of that.
Maybe that's where you should recruit new members.
I don't. We may be the Church of the Good Shepherd, but I don't steal sheep. I'm just happy to have the sheep sort of join us, and that's fine. I do want to ask for those who were here last week or who were able to join us via the recordings, if there were any questions that anybody had, and then we'll move into what we're going to do this evening. So I want to know if there are any questions, and then we're going to move into how the Episcopal Church or Anglican Church got to America, and then the Episcopal Church Board. We're going to do more of that this evening. But are there any questions that people had from last week? Seeing none, you're going to have to be assertive given the nature of the way that Zoom allows me to view screens and stuff like that. So if you do have questions, just be assertive. So, okay. So, tonight, come on, screen. There we go. I'm going to go back a little bit and pick up from where we were last evening and or last week, and then move us forward into the Episcopal Church coming to the United States, or the Anglican Church of England, the Anglican Communion coming to the United States. So, and then for those of you who weren't here last time, that's tonight. Going back to last week. Next week, we're going to launch into worship and spirituality. And we're going to talk about how Episcopalians read the Bible, and then how do we think theologically, and then how do we run ourselves? How do we govern ourselves? And what are our thoughts about mission? So I'm not going to go through this overview every week, but I did want to do that again tonight, just for those folks who are joining us this evening. So that's kind of the overview of what we're going to be doing the next 5 weeks. And curious if anybody has any questions on that before we move forward. Has everybody been able to get a book? That's one question I have here.
Yes.
Okay, all right. We get books every year because we know that I'm going to be doing this. And so sometimes we have a lot on hand, sometimes we don't. And I know there's a little bit of back and forth about all of that. So, okay, so tonight I want to jump back just a little bit to where we were, and I'm not going to go all the way back to where we started because we ran through, I don't know, 1,000 or more years of Christian history. And tonight we're going to run through close to another 1,000 years. And fortunately for you all, and for me, but for you all, you don't have to listen to me do all of the historical stuff. But I do need to pick up a bit. And again, what I really want to sort of focus on are issues in Western church history that have an impact on the Episcopal Church as we experience it today. So I think about the point we left off last week was kind of in the 13th, 14th, 15th century. It got a little fuzzy towards the end. But, you know, in the 13th century, the early part of the 13th century, most of you know the name of Francis, St. Francis of Assisi. And that was where, you know, Francis was a little bit concerned about what was going on in the church of his day. He thought it was a little bit more formal and all of that. And he sort of had this vision about restoring the church. And what he wanted to do was do that in a way that affected the common folks. So really, I just want to point out that in the 13th century, beginning of the 13th century, we had Francis. He'll come back just in a few minutes. He'll come back, but I want to point him out right now. Also in the early part of the 13th century, the photo there on the left is of Salisbury Cathedral. Now, Christianity, of course, had been in Britain by this point, for 1,000 years. And it was being built up and expanding. And one of the places where it landed was and began to take root and be expressed was in Salisbury. This particular cathedral means where the bishop sits. And so here is a bishop in Salisbury. This cathedral became very, very influential in how Anglican worship, the Episcopal Church's worship, arose. And we are heirs of that. And we'll talk about that more over the next several weeks. But again, when we talk about all this history, I really want to sort of bring home that we're talking about this because it has an impact on how we worship every Sunday at church, or every season at church. So just these aren't, I could have picked a lot of dates, but I chose dates that have to do really with us as Episcopalians in the United States, and then as Episcopalians at Good Shepherd. In the 12th century, and I'm going back just a little bit before this slide, you know, Francis of Assisi shows up in the early 13th century. The Dominicans show up in the early 13th century, the followers of St. Dominic. And then in the early parts of the 13th century, the Dominican monks move out of Spain and Italy, and they're doing this missionary outwork. Outwork? No. They're taking stuff. What's the word? Lost the word. Outreach, that's the word. Into all over Europe, and they arrive in Britain. And the Dominicans were an order, a monastic order, and following Saint Dominic, they arrived and started to establish their presence in Britain. Just a few years later, the Franciscans, the followers of Francis, arrived, and both of them began to establish communities around Britain, and were doing evangelistic work in the British Isles. Roger Bacon, and I'm kind of rushing through this, Roger Bacon and William of Ockham were both members of these orders and had an impact on how we began to do theology. William of Ockham was a significant theologian, and he's known for something that's called Occam's razor about how we do theology. If something is complex or if something is simple, Occam would say, go for the simplest. So how do we think theologically? So the Dominicans arrived, the Franciscans arrived. Bacon was one of those folks who he invented the telescope, the microscope, and the thermometer. So here is a Franciscan monk who is doing science. All right. And for us as Episcopalians, this, I don't want to say, the separation of science and theology has not necessarily been there for us. We have inherited that as something that is united going back now, 800 years. So this is, again, how do we think theologically? All of these kinds of things. So both of these guys, Roger Bacon and William of Ockham, monastics, these were people who were steeped in the church, devoted to Christ, and they wanted to figure out how all of this worked in the modern world, in their own world. Then we move a little bit forward into the 14th and through the 16th century. Names you will hear in the Episcopal Church are Julian of Norwich, a well-known mystic who wrote of all of her experiences in something that's called the Revelations of Divine Love. And one of the things that she says is that all shall be well, all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well. So again, this sense of how do we move forward as Christians and not being tied to the past or all those kinds of things. It's all going to be okay. And I have to say, as worry prone as I am personally, to hear Julian say over and over and over again, all will be well, all will be well, all manner of things will be well, is so helpful for me to keep in mind, I'm not in control, God's in control, all will be well, all manner of things will be well. So you'll hear lots of references in the Episcopal Church to Julian of Norwich. John Wycliffe, 1381 there, and that's a picture of him there on your right, was a theologian at Oxford University. So here's this university that was founded, 800 or 900 years ago. He had issues with the sort of predominant theory or theology of the Roman Catholic Church about communion, about what happens with the bread and the wine. We'll talk about this a lot when we start talking about sacraments, but he really appeals to the Bible in his arguments about this and puts himself in opposition with the Roman Catholic Church at this point. And now he was in Oxford, so here's this Brit having issues with what's going on in the Roman Catholic Church. Again, a name that is part of who we have become, but we don't don't hear about him a lot. I threw in Geoffrey Chaucer because lots of us have heard of Chaucer, Canterbury Tales, if nothing else.
Yeah, sure.
And so to put him in context, here he is in the latter part of the 14th century. He's writing about Canterbury. He's writing about these pilgrimages and all of that. So here is Chaucer in Britain in the midst of all of these conversations that we're having. Move a little bit further into the 15th century, we get Marjorie Kempe, who was this kind of crazy woman who had visions, but was very, very important in the life of the sort of late medieval church. But from Britain, again, you hear about her. We don't talk about her much, but every so often you hear about her. And remember that she's in this history of who we are as Episcopalians. Then we get to the end of the 15th century. We have what, a lot of people hear about, the War of the Roses. And who's going to be ruling Britain? Who's going to be ruling England? And at the end of the War of the Roses, we get Henry the seventh, not the eighth, the seventh. But he was the first of the reign of the Tudors, of which Henry the eighth, which is really important for us, is sort of the heir. So all of that is really, really quickly to get us into the 16th century. So there's stuff in the book and in the articles that talk about all this, but this gets us up to really where I wanted to begin tonight. So the Church of England emerges out of this long history, and going back to last week, this long history of Celtic Christianity being there from the time the Romans first arrived, and then all of the Roman Catholic stuff moving through Europe, and then also being sort of established in Britain. And all of this leads to this, to the point of Henry VIII, but also the point of the Reformation. And we're now into the 16th century and want to move through this relatively quickly. So you'll remember in 1516, you may remember, or you'll learn, in 1516, Luther hammered his theses on the door of the church in Wittenberg, his issues about what the Roman Catholic Church was doing. And he had questions about that. And so, he hammered those up, and that began the Protestant Reformation. And we're heirs, obviously, we're heirs of that. And his books started showing up. Luther's books started showing up in Britain in the early part of the 16th century. And there were a group of students in Cambridge, at the University of Cambridge, who formed a study group at a place called the White Horse Tavern. Sounds really sort of very Episcopalian, like you're going to have a book group at a bar. And they were reading Luther's work, and a guy named Thomas Cranmer, and we'll hear a little bit more about him, was one of the folks who were in these groups. And so Lutheranism, or Luther's works, are in Britain, but the Episcopal, the Roman Catholic Church still sort of held sway in Britain. But Henry VIII began to question some of this, and he wasn't sure about Luther. He wasn't sure about his traditional stuff, and so at this point, he was really against Luther. So Henry VIII, that guy that we keep hearing about in the Episcopal Church, wrote a book against Luther. And so the Pope at that point thought that Henry VIII was kind of a cool guy and gave him the title Defender of the Faith. So the Pope gave the King of England the title Defender of the Faith because the King of England was in opposition to Luther. Charles III, the current King of England, still owns the title Defender of the Faith. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more as we. So Henry VIII, we hear about him and all of his 8 wives and all of that kind of stuff, and founded the Episcopal Church. That's not there's a lot more that's going on with Henry VIII. You know, he got special permission to marry his brother's virgin widow, but she couldn't bear a son. And then he met Anne Boleyn, and he wanted to get an annulment so he could marry Anne Boleyn. And so, I mean, this stuff about providing an heir and keeping all of this going got all entangled in Henry VIII's personal life, his ability or non-ability to produce an heir. How does this work with the Roman Catholic Church and the relations of the Catholic Church with England? All of this gets all sort of mixed up, but it comes out with, you know, the Pope said, I'm not going to annul your marriage to Catherine. And well, it was because he was being held prisoner by her nephew. I mean, the politics in Europe were so convoluted. And so Henry says, enough with this. I'm the King of England. We're tired of being beholden to Rome. We're tired of having all of the monies from us going to Rome to support your wars against Spain. We're tired of all of these monastic lands and the money not coming to the crown. We're tired of all of this. And so we're going to establish the church here in Britain. And yes, it had something to do with the divorces, but it had more to do with politics and money. And, you know, that's just the way that the church in general works. So in the early parts of the 1530s, Thomas Cranmer was appointed Archbishop by Henry VIII, and we began to see the development of what we now know as the Church of England. In a few years later, Cranmer begins to write what was at that point the beginning of what we have as the Book of Common Prayer. He was told to write prayers for the army. He did that, and that is where we got our Book of Common Prayer. In the middle of the 16th century, Roman Catholic Church realized that the Reformation may have had something valuable to say, and so they convened a council, the Council of Trent, and what was known as the Counter-Reformation began. Well, Britain was off on its own track at that point. 1549, Cranmer and the first Book of Common Prayer was written. It was dedicated on the introduced on the day of Pentecost in 1549, and at that point, Anglicanism, the Church of England, began to take its root in Britain. Well, not everybody was happy with that at all. And it did not make the folks who were more Protestant than Catholic happy. Bloody Mary was a militant Roman Catholic and became queen. And so she started punching down on these Protestants. And so in 1559, that Book of Common Prayer was revised. Then we get into this period of Puritanism. So when Luther sort of did his separation from the Roman Catholic Church, there was also John Calvin in Switzerland, and he took his own version of Christianity and developed it, and it took root in the northern part of Britain. So again, I'm going to run through this quickly. You can read more about this. Richard Hooker, famous Anglican theologian, on the Church of England side, not on the Calvinist side, wrote a book called The Rules of Ecclesiastical Polity, a wonderful title, but helped define, and we'll hear about him more in the weeks to come, help define Anglican theological thinking. And again, we'll hear more about him. Well, and then later part of the 16th century, we've got Shakespeare. So put Shakespeare in all of the midst of this. And some of the things that Shakespeare wrote, he ridicules Puritanism in the persons of Falstaff and other characters that show up in his plays. So again, this is not stuff that we don't know about, but we don't think about. In the early part of the 17th century, this sort of semi-Protestant queen, Elizabeth I, is succeeded by James the First, and the prayer book has arrived again, and it's James the First, King James the First, who commissions an English language Bible, the King James Bible, not St. James, but he commissions a Bible based on the best scholarship at the time, and he wants it in English. Further on, we get the Scottish prayer book, again, trying to take what Cranmer had done, moving it into Scotland. The Scots, many of the Scots were Protestants, Puritans. They didn't like this, but there were others who did. And then in the 1640s, we get Civil War. And if you're a historian at all of English history, or you'll remember the British or the English Civil War between the Protestants and the Catholics. This is, or the Scots and the English. And this is, again, part of who we are. As I was looking over all of this earlier today, I was reminded that where we are in the 21st century as Episcopalians is the product of a lot of struggle, a lot of trying to figure out how do we move between certain parts of the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. How do we do this? And it was bloody. These were not just, sort of nice conversations. This was really, really bloody. So we've got all of these other kinds of things that happen. You see John Milton in there. The clergy were demanded to conform to the crown. And then finally, in the latter part of the 17th century, they said, well, we can have us both here. It's a challenge, but we can have us both here. And we'll move forward. Early part of the 18th century, I note Isaac Watts, because we sing a lot of his hymns. He began to write music or write poems that were turned into hymns. I threw in Jonathan Swift. You'll remember him from Gulliver's Travels. And there, that reflects, all of this is part of the way that the church moved from Jesus, the Middle Ages, all of that into Britain, and then shook itself out, and then began to move to the US or to Americas. Because if you think about going back to 1662, that's, or even a little bit earlier, that's when British settlers were beginning to colonize America. Okay. So as I said last time, I'm a historian, I'm a geek, but I believe that knowing our past really helps us understand our present. So we're going to move from here into a couple of videos, but before, and they'll take up the rest of the evening. They're about 40 minutes long between the two of them. But I want to see if there are any questions. And I know this is way overload. And I feel for Amaru who's doesn't have a lot of Western civilization, all these other kinds of historical classes behind him. But are there any questions at this point before I try and make sure that I can do all of the technology necessary to play a DVD over Zoom? Any questions, please?
No.
Everybody's overwhelmed. I understand how that works. Okay, so not seeing that, I'm going to move out of this this particular screen share and get us into another one. This is where it becomes a little bit tricky. All right. Now, okay. All right. Screen share. Come on. Share. Too many screens going on. That's the challenge. All right. Aha. Come on, play. Oh, where'd it go? I'll get it there. Sorry. I thought I had this all set up. There we go. Are you seeing this?
Yes.
All right.
And in terms of now extremely dead and somewhat boring people, then if you look at the alternative and say, well, the whole of church history is boring by comparison.
Are you hearing
That's a
it?
bit of a trade-off. At least we don't
Seems
have
a little low.
Yeah.
yes. All over everywhere. But the
Turn it up a
problem with
little
the
bit.
trade-off
All right, you're gonna have to do that at your end.
is
I've got it
that
up as high as I can at mine.
All right.
in the United States.
Did you
And
unmute?
that turns out to be manifestly false.
We are not an English nation of prayer. We are an American Episcopal Church. What we have inherited are some learnings from the Reformation, a biblical base, a respect for governance that includes clergy and laity, an emphasis on churches that worship in the vernacular and that change their worship. We've inherited all of that, as well as a stance toward Rome. But how that translates once we cross the ocean is very American.
Jamestown. The church down in Williamsburg.
Yeah.
Speed report. I didn't want to touch it.
In the year 1579, Sir Francis Drake landed at a bay in Northern California. There, the ship's chaplain conducted services from the English Book of Common Prayer. England's church had come to America. But the church did not take root until 28 years later, when 3 ships of English colonists sailed up a river in Virginia and established the settlement at Jamestown. There, the Reverend Robert Hunt celebrated the first Anglican Eucharist in North America. Their church was an old sail stretched between several trees. The actual site of that first Eucharist is now here, beneath the shifting waters of the James River. A more permanent house of worship was soon built. This is a reconstruction of that rustic church. As the Virginia colony flourished, many more churches were built, such as Bruton Parish in Williamsburg, Pohick Church, and Christ Church, Alexandria. St. Luke's Church in Smithfield, built perhaps as early as 1632, is the oldest standing church in the original 13 colonies. Its style reflects what the colonists remembered from home, a medieval parish church set down in the American wilderness. Christ Church, Lancaster County was built by a prosperous planter 100 years later. The Georgian exterior reflects the pride and bearing of plantation society. But inside, vanity gives way to the beauty of holiness. The settling of Virginia opened a new chapter for the Church of England. It had crossed the sea to a place far from Canterbury. In this program, we'll see how the English, or Anglican Church, adapted itself to life in this new land and eventually became an American Episcopal Church. The Anglican Church expanded throughout the colonies, becoming the established church not only in Virginia but also in Maryland, the Carolinas, Georgia, and parts of New York. In 1689, Boston's King's Chapel became the first Anglican church in the Puritan stronghold of New England. 1693 saw the founding of William and Mary, the first Anglican college. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel sent dedicated missionaries to spread the Anglican way. Their success caused Thomas Jefferson to refer to them as Anglican Jesuits. In the 18th century, Anglican congregations were formed all along the eastern seaboard. Some Anglicans dreamed of becoming the established church for all the colonies, a religious melting pot that could unite the separate denominations. The Anglican Church would toll its bells and all Americans would come to worship. But it would be pluralism, not Anglicanism, that would rule American religion. The Church of England was only one among many, and although it was often influential, it would always be a minority church.
By and large, the people who go to Episcopal churches like to think of themselves as important and influential and in control, and somehow when you say it's just a small church, that makes them feel uncomfortable and perhaps even uncomfortable about inviting other people into it.
We're not a majority church. Are we going to lie on our back and apologize for it? Or are we going to get on and get with the work that we're given to do in a certain place? The thing I like about the Episcopal Church in this country, in her best representation, is that she tries to look at reality and not look stupid, not deny what's going on. What would be the Tupperware Prize if we were the largest denomination in this country?
If we're going to understand the story of the Anglican Church in the colonies, we need to understand the obstacles which Anglicans faced. One of these obstacles was the absence of bishops. We are called an Episcopal Church because we believe that the episcopate, that is the ministry of bishops, is very important to our life together. Bishops represent the continuity and faithfulness of the church. They stand in a line of succession from the apostles, whose mission was established by Jesus Christ. The presence of the bishop reminds us that the church today is a continuation of the apostolic mission to the world. The bishop guides the church as chief pastor and ordains new bishops, priests, and deacons. But there were no bishops in America for 177 years after Jamestown was founded. There were no bishops because England had no clear plan for the church in America. And many Americans would not have tolerated bishops in the colonies. In the Old World, bishops were lords of the state, wielding a political power often indistinguishable from tyranny. Colonists had no desire for bishops who might rob them of their liberty. Anglican parishes grew accustomed to the independence afforded by the absence of bishops. In Virginia, for example, vestries enjoyed great power. Priests were regarded as hired hands. It was lay people who ran the churches. But how could the church expand without bishops to ordain and confirm? Candidates for priesthood had to take a ship to England for ordination. It was a long and dangerous journey. 1 out of every 5 died before he ever returned to take a parish. Anglicans faced another obstacle. The colonies were soon flooded by a wave of immigrants that were not English. As the English became a minority, so did their church. Anglicans would have to reach out to new constituencies if they wanted to grow. Native Americans and black slaves were obvious candidates. From his pulpit in London, John Donne had cried out to the colonists, "Be a light to these Gentiles that sit in darkness. Enamor them with your justice, but inflame them with your godliness and your religion." Both Native Americans and blacks were baptized, but the cultural tide flowed against such inclusiveness, and Anglicans, like other Americans, generally regarded Indian wars as normal and slavery as tolerable. Could the church reach out to include members of other denominations? This is Old Swedes Church in Wilmington, Delaware. Built in 1697, it is the oldest continuously used church building in America. Here, a congregation of Swedish Lutherans feeling cut off from their homeland eventually joined the Episcopal Church. Various German, French, and Dutch congregations also became Anglican. In 1722, Timothy Cutler and 6 other Puritan leaders shocked their peers at Yale by announcing their conversion to the Church of England. The Puritans became alarmed at the prospect of New England turning Anglican. But there would be no mass conversions. The differences were too strong. Puritans did not want bishops, and in theology, their emphasis on predestination made free will insignificant. Most Anglicans, on the other hand, believed that free will and reason, aided by grace, played an important part in the Christian life.
In our heritage, reason has been a very rich word. It can be and has been equated with conscience. The reason which I think of when I think of the fellowship and the love of God is not to be equated with genius, but has to do with the exercise of something which every human being has, and that's the ability to make decisions and to speak with one another in such ways that we can better understand one another.
I believe perhaps our strongest vocation today as Episcopalians, as Anglicans, is as a Catholic Church in love with freedom, because we have the whole heritage of Christendom in our broad and wonderful Catholic faith. And we also have freedom of the intellect, freedom of the heart, and freedom of conscience.
The colonies contained many unchurched men and women who needed to hear the good news, but the Church of England lacked the flexibility to keep up with an expanding frontier. An itinerant preacher could get on his horse and head off into the wilderness. An Anglican priest was more rooted to a parish and to a fixed way of doing church. And for clergy trained in more civilized places, the colonial frontier could seem rather disconcerting. Gideon Johnston arrived in Charlestown, South Carolina in 1710 as an Anglican missionary. He took one look around and he wrote back to his bishop in England, "The people here are the vilest race of men upon the earth, being a perfect hodgepodge of bankrupts, pirates, decayed libertines, sectaries, and enthusiasts. In other words," Johnston wrote, "they are not our kind."
The charge about snobism on the part of the Episcopal Church, or intellectual elitism, has some foundation, but part of our community discipline as a result is always a very high accent on confession. And what do Episcopalians confess? They don't just confess that they used the wrong fork for the salad. You know, we really do confess that we've set ourselves higher than we ought to have, that we have somehow felt it was okay to do things that were really inappropriate because we kind of felt like we had the intellectual background to do them, or we could handle them, right? And in fact, we discovered we couldn't. So I'm not surprised that the Book of Common Prayer has stressed so strongly the need to be involved in confession.
Then came the Great Awakening. In the middle of the 18th century, a great religious revival swept through the colonies like a forest fire. It was a religion of profound inner experience and often wild displays of emotion. Countless Americans were caught up in it, but Anglicans were ambivalent about too much feeling and enthusiasm in religion. Theirs was a religion of form and order and decorum, the safe and sane alternative to the fireworks of revival religion. Nevertheless, the Great Awakening did affect Anglicanism. Preaching became more important, and pulpits dominated many churches. The emotion of hymn singing replaced the dryness of metrical psalms, and there was a new emphasis on Christianity as a personal faith, a matter of the heart as well as the mind. In 1773, a 14-year-old Anglican named Martha Lawrence could write about her faith with evangelical fervor.
Hear, O thou God of heaven, that henceforth I am thine, entirely thine. I would not merely consecrate unto thee some of my powers, or give some of my possessions, but I would be wholly thine, and thine forever.
When the Revolution came, the church faced its greatest crisis. As the fires of rebellion rose, so did the feelings against everything English. The Church of England became a victim of the times. Many Anglicans were patriots. At St. John's, Richmond, Patrick Henry rose up from his pew to cry, "Give me liberty, or give me death." The sexton of Boston's Old North Church climbed the tower to signal Paul Revere. George Washington and 2/3 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Anglican. But many Anglicans believed in a God of order, not confusion. Rebellion against established authority seemed dangerous, even sinful. And every priest at his ordination had sworn loyalty to the king. He was also bound to say the prayer for King George III in the prayer book services. Some priests simply crossed out the offending prayer. Others bravely tried to read it above the hisses and catcalls of their congregations. The church lost both clergy and laity. Many fled to Canada and England. The church also lost its financial base. No longer the beneficiary of tax support or contributions from England, the church would now have to depend on the stewardship of its members.
Leaders, members, funding, all had been decimated by the Revolution. And equally devastating was the blow to the church's identity. There had never been an Anglican church apart from England. What place was there for a hierarchical Episcopal church in a republic? And where would the church get bishops?
In this house in Woodbury, Connecticut, 10 clergy met in 1783 to elect Samuel Seabury to be the first American bishop. Since English law did not yet permit the consecration of a non-Englishman, Seabury had to go to Aberdeen, Scotland, where 3 Scottish bishops laid their hands on him and made him bishop in 1784. Meanwhile, Anglicans throughout the colonies were meeting to reorganize the church. Maryland provided a new name, the Episcopal Church. And on September 27, 1785, 16 clergy and 26 laymen met at Christ Church, Philadelphia, for the first General Convention. A constitution and a revised prayer book were drafted. 16 months later, 2 more bishops were consecrated, this time in England, William White of Pennsylvania and Samuel Prevost of New York. Bishop White, chief architect of the new church constitution, would become the church's venerated leader for the next half-century. But when White and Prevost returned from England in 1786, they found the church on the verge of schism. Bishop Seabury and the New England churches did not like the proposed constitution, which limited bishops' power and gave a strong role to the laity. They also objected to some of the new prayer book. But in 1789, charity and compromise prevailed. A new constitution and prayer book were approved by the Third General Convention. the Episcopal Church in America was born. In 1792, Thomas J. Claggett was consecrated bishop by Seabury, White, and Prevost. It was the first consecration in America and united the English and Scottish lines of succession.
The fear of bishops, which certainly had existed in the colonies before the Revolution, one reason why the American Anglicans could not get bishops, and didn't, in a sense, want them themselves. They were a little fearful of what would happen. That went away after you got real bishops functioning. The fears kind of disappeared. For example, Seabury arrived. They couldn't, the English bishops didn't know what would ever happen to him. There was no palace was provided. He had no seat in the legislature. He had no carriage. But you discovered that that wasn't essential to being a bishop.
The historic episcopate had passed to the United States, but these bishops were to be servants, not lords of the people. The Episcopal Church had inherited 1,500 years of English doctrine and discipline, but now it was an American church, democratic and independent from England, and it entered the 19th century with a new vocation, to be a church both Catholic and Reformed in a time and place uniquely its own.
Okay, I'm going to stop here and try and get us to the next video. But I'm curious as to whether or not anybody has any questions at this point. Any questions, comments? Again, going back to what I was saying earlier, is our history is so complex, bringing together streams of Catholicism and Protestantism and the Celts and all of that kind of stuff, and then it arrives at the in the Americas, and that's the big challenge: is how do we take it forward out of that? So again, I'm listening to see if there are any questions, and as I try do the technological thing to get us into the other video, the next video that gets us a little closer to the present. Yes, no? Let's see, just a second. Too many technological things going on here. Find it. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. Any questions?
Not so much a question, but a comment. I didn't realize it was quite as chaotic, maybe.
Okay.
At the beginning. I guess I didn't know very much about the Episcopal Church when it started out in America, so that's my own ignorance. So.
Well, that's all right. Well, we all learn these bits and pieces of things, so thank you, Sue. Other questions or comments before I try and get this next piece going? You know, and as you, I hope, are seeing that the next thing is 23 minutes, which will get us to about 20 minutes after the hour. So we'll have more time for more questions. All right. Let's see if this, anything else at this point?
Nope.
Yep. Okay. Move the dial forward here.
The Anglican tradition simply is what it is. This tradition that has been handed down for the last 400 years and more in England and the United States, with the succession of bishops and a succession of theologians and a succession of philosophers, and really, most importantly, the succession of people in parishes who day in and day out live their lives in accordance with this Anglican way.
The question is never really, what do we have, but rather, what is it in our common life that enables us to proclaim what Christ has?
We offer, at our best, a beautiful liturgy which really touches the spirit. And I think we offer respect for the dignity of the person.
A religion that blesses. Somebody once expressed it as a religion that blesses rather than curses or diminishes or limits.
If we have anything that marks us and identifies us, it has to do with the church at worship, and in particular the church engaged in Holy Communion.
It's English, and it's American, it's Catholic, it's evangelical, it's parochial, it's universal.
If you write a history of the church in America, it ought to be at least half about religious education and the other half about mission. But it's now half about general conventions or whatever, I don't know, church architecture. My understanding of the church is a group of clergy and laity, people of God gathered. I don't start with Canterbury. I start with that local parish and those people gathered and how they carry out that mission.
In the decades that followed the American Revolution, the fields were ripe for harvest. New lands were opening to the West, and new immigrants continued to arrive from overseas. It was a time for evangelism, a time for mission. In this program, we'll see how the church responded to new challenges and became the church we know today.
Education was considered essential. Sunday schools were formed, and schools, colleges, and seminaries were built. Societies were formed to distribute Bibles, prayer books, and tracts. Institutions were created to minister to the sick, the friendless, and the needy. Efforts were made to include minorities. In 1795, Absalom Jones was the first black ordained to the priesthood. In 1820, the Domestic and Foreign Mission Society was created, in effect defining every Episcopalian as a missionary.
Groups of people went out to various places. They were lay people, established churches, lied. Women said they were men so they could get the right number to found a church. Dragoon somebody to come in and be a bishop to recognize a potential missionary diocese emerging.
The word apostolic always sounds as if it is attached to the past and backward-looking. That is, we receive the tradition of the apostles. But the word apostolic comes from a Greek word which means to be sent. It is really the word for mission in Greek.
The stories of the pioneering bishops represent a missionary spirit which animated the whole church. In the Northeast, a period of church growth and mission outreach was ushered in by evangelical Alexander Griswold in New England and High Churchman John Henry Hobart in New York, who were both consecrated in 1811. Philander Chase left a comfortable Connecticut parish to face the rigors of the Ohio wilderness. When he became the first bishop of Ohio in 1818, this was his first episcopal palace. In 1835, the church made Jackson Kemper its first missionary bishop to the American frontier. He helped create 6 Midwestern dioceses and made missionary journeys ranging from the Gulf states to the North Woods. In the South, the church was revived and expanded under such bishops as Richard Channing Moore in Virginia, John Ravenscroft in North Carolina, James Odie in Tennessee, and Leonidas Polk in Arkansas and Louisiana. Joseph Talbot, whose diocese of the Northwest covered 750,000 square miles from the Dakotas to Nevada, was called the Bishop of all outdoors. With the Diocese of California, where William Kipp became bishop in the 1850s, the Episcopal Church had spanned the continent. The Book of Common Prayer, recited on a nearby beach 3 centuries earlier, now had a home in new churches like Trinity, San Francisco, St. Paul's in the state capital at Benicia. and the Gold Rush missions of Trinity and Emmanuel. Episcopalians carried the gospel to Native Americans. Ngabo, a Minnesota Chippewa, was the first of his people to be ordained. In the Plains states, nearly half the Sioux people became Episcopalians, and thousands gathered every year for church convocations. The church also felt a call to evangelize the world. William J. Boone was the first overseas missionary bishop, going to China in 1845. Mission activity grew, and today there are indigenous Episcopal dioceses in Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. While education and mission went on, the church was also trying to define itself in relation to the rest of American religion. High Church Episcopalians emphasized the form and order of the church. Without bishops and valid sacraments, they argued, there could be no fully authentic church. Low Church Episcopalians were not so concerned with the things which made their church unique. Instead, they emphasized the things they shared in common with other churches and practiced a more evangelical style of preaching and witness. High and Low Church were the polarities, with most falling somewhere in between. William Augustus Muhlenberg called himself an evangelical Catholic. At the Church of the Holy Communion in New York, he introduced high church rituals and admitted Anne Ayres as the first American Anglican nun. But he also tried to open the church to a wider circle. He abolished rental fees for pews so that the poor could attend church for free. And in 1853, he called upon the House of Bishops to make the church less rigid and more pluralistic.
We need to see ministry in a much more diverse way. We need to see the hospitals, the convalescent centers, the juvenile halls, the prisons. We need to see the neighborhoods as places of ministry. We need to see the churches as one form of ecclesial gathering place. But we need to recognize that the church's ministry really needs to be on the streets.
The church's work is never done because the church's work is more than just looking out for the people in the congregation. It's looking out for all of the hurt and oppressed and destroyed people in the society and pointing to the contradictions in the society that create those conditions. And that work will always be there. To the extent that parishes have started soup kitchens, for example, that's the first step. But are they prepared to take the second step, which is to bring the people into the church? If they're prepared to take the second step, then there's some hope. But if they just view this as, well, we're doing this because it's our Christian duty, but these aren't our kind of people because they're hungry and poor out of work, then people are going to get the message. They'll take the food, but they won't take the literature. So that's that.
In 1886, the House of Bishops adopted the Chicago-Lambeth Quadrilateral as a starting point for Christian reunion. This quadrilateral specified the 4 minimum requirements for an authentic church. Holy Scripture is the revealed Word of God. The Nicene Creed is the sufficient statement of faith. The sacraments of baptism and Eucharist. The historic episcopate.
In all other matters, the Episcopal Church was ready, as the bishops put it, in the spirit of love and humility to forego all preferences of her own. No one took the bishops up on their offer. Such visions would have to wait for a more ecumenical century.
We do not assume that it is essential to the faith that we be around. The things that we're about as a community will continue to happen whether or not there are Episcopalians. There's some other people in the larger Christian body who do the things that we do. It's not that we are essential to the faith. It's that we are doing things that for us are essential. In some ways, we're always willing to ask the question, should the Episcopal Church be going out of business? Should we return into some larger ecumenical fold? At the same time, when we don't see the things happening in those larger contexts that we do, we're perfectly willing to say, but we won't enter that fold if we don't get to do the things that we do as a community, because we think they're valid. We think they're important ways of being Christian. We are, in fact, the body of Christ, visible and present in these peculiar times and with these peculiar people.
In the 1840s, the Oxford movement reached the United States from England. Its aim was to renew the vocation of the church by a strong emphasis on Catholic tradition and practice. The Eucharist became more central, and ritual became more ceremonial. Sung services and colored vestments were introduced. Monastic orders were created. These changes brought controversy. Many feared that Reformation principles were being abandoned. Others were simply uncomfortable with elaborate ritual. Some bishops refused to enter a church if there were candles on the altar. The General Convention of 1871 considered banning many practices which are commonplace today, such as processional crosses and the mixing of water and wine. Eventually, the battles gave way to toleration and diversity. Church architecture, meanwhile, began to regard the Middle Ages as the golden age of Christianity. In Philadelphia, St. James the Less was built in the 1840s as an exact replica of a 13th century English church. Colonial churches such as Christ Church, Philadelphia, had been rational and full of light. The stone and shadows of St. James appealed to a more romantic sense of mystery. This Gothic style quickly spread. St. John the Divine in New York, begun as a Romanesque structure, was finished in the Gothic style. Gothic was also chosen for the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. Other styles also became popular, but the aim was always the same: to evoke the beauty of holiness. Church architecture provided an instant vision of the richness and depth of our faith. In the words of one church architect, "Let us dip our pencils in the hues of heaven, borrow the tints of a cloudless sky or a setting sun, transfer the bright star from its amethystine vault to our church's ceilings, and call angels from heaven to keep watch over the faithful." Many Episcopal buildings symbolically proclaim the authority and importance of the Episcopal Church. But how much effect do we really have on the society around us? How much effect should we have?
The church has enormous power, not only as a moral and social force, but even as an institution. We have to be stewards not only of our talent and our treasure, but also of our power, and to use our moral power and our institutional power and our political power for the powerless.
I think that the pattern that happens works something like this. A denomination becomes very politically active, gets its fingers burnt on the stove, withdraws from political activity, and then tries to make a virtue out of that non-activity. Episcopalians were extraordinarily active in church-state matters at the turn of the century. And then in the 20s, when the American churches began to hash out the fundamental modernist controversy, Episcopalians began to sort of step back and talk about us as a denomination that was above such divisions. We were not going to enter a brief in the Scopes trial or somehow enter strongly one side or another in the political arena in regard to evolution in American educational systems. However, in the 60s and 70s, we showed a willingness to involve ourselves in matters of public policy, and to some degree we felt like conservatives did in the 1920s, that our fingers were burned on the stove, we lost membership, and so I think at this time we are setting back. I suspect, if history continues as it has, that we will reverse our field again before too long, and will again be interested in deeper political voice and activity as a denomination.
I think the great strength of the Episcopal Church is that it admits that it has to live in a culture and contend with that culture, not to put sacred on one side and secular on the other. Those are not two separate but equal categories. They're two realities in human living. And if we don't contend with the culture, we're not an Anglican church. I think we're not even a realistic church.
The abolitionist movement and the Civil War provide one of the most interesting cases of the Church's interaction with social issues. During the controversy over slavery, which led to the Civil War, the Episcopal Church did not take an official position. There were Episcopalians on both sides who held strong views, but the Church itself remained silent. It preferred gradual change to violent apocalypse. But there was another reason for Episcopal silence on the slavery question. The Church was an ark of refuge from social conflict. The peace and unity of Christ's Church had to be maintained above all else. When the Civil War broke out, however, a separate Confederate Episcopal Church was formed. Bishop Leonidas Polk became a Confederate general, meeting his God at the hands of Sherman's artillery. But Bishop Polk had made a point of praying for Northern bishops in public, and at general conventions in the North, the names of the absent Southern bishops were still included in the roll call. Such displays of mutual respect allowed the Church to be reunited quickly when the war ended. In some other denominations, the divisions of the Civil War have been slow to heal. But the price of Episcopal unity was official silence on the greatest moral question of the 19th century.
If you think of the Church as an instrument of unity and an instrument of peace, that doesn't mean having your own Episcopalians not bothered. It means bringing enough justice in the world so there can be real peace for everybody. And often the role of reconciliation in the world brings conflict within the Church. And I think you have to keep your eye on the ball, that we are here for the world, not for the Church.
So many of the tellings of the history of the Episcopal Church avoid controversy. And that's wrong, I think, because tension is not a bad thing. A church without tension is a church that should be pronounced dead and be buried.
The Episcopal Church has been able to contain many polarities, Catholic and Reformed, formal and enthusiastic, traditional and innovative. We are sometimes hard to define, but one thing is certain: there is room for everyone within our walls. A family is bound together not by its ability to agree, but by its ability to love.
My definition of the church is a church with a human face. The church is the people of God. And when we start thinking about our own reality in this country and stories that get told about our own parishes, as if the only person in that parish was the rector, isn't it funny, for example, when we read histories of parishes and they're really histories of one rector after another? I mean, what a lie. I mean, even those rectors, I don't believe, would like that. What we choose to notice says a lot about who we are. I choose to notice laity. I choose to notice children. I choose to notice women. I was educated to notice bishops and rectors, and I did all that traditional church history, and I'm thankful for that. but I know it was a very limited story. I now choose to notice those who have been silent in the records because the records didn't notice them, or silenced. Ask folks about their mothers, grandmothers, sisters, aunts. Ask people whom they remember in their early days as members of this church.
When I was a child, there was one year when I went to Sunday school every Sunday of the year. And the last Sunday of the year, I got the measles and was in the hospital. And the priest came to the hospital and put on a surgical mask and came in and pinned my Sunday school pin on my gown. I have no notion what role that finally plays in who I am historically as an Episcopalian, but I know it's fairly strong. My grandmother was very active as a young woman in a parish which her mother founded. That is to say, her mother got together with some other people and started saying evening prayer. And after a while, they started saying morning prayer. And after a while, they started asking for a priest to come in once a month to do the sacraments. And after a while, there was a parish. That's where the heroes of the faith turn out to be.
All right. So I'm only going to make one comment, and then I just want to hear questions or anything else like that. There was a picture at the end of that video with a bishop and a clown. You may remember that.
Yeah.
That was Bishop William Swing of the Diocese of California, and he confirmed me as an Episcopalian, and he also baptized my daughter. So as far as I know, he's still alive. He's a good friend, a really, really great bishop, served for a long, long time. Anyway, so that's my connection to the video. Obviously, the video ended. I mean, it was produced quite a while ago, and it hasn't moved. The church has moved on from some of the things that it was showing in these videos, but and they're dated, and I understand that. But for the most part, I think they do a good job of presenting a snapshot of the church from the Revolutionary War up until the relative present. We'll talk more about all of this as we go on, but I want to see if there were comments or questions that anyone has after watching these two things. And I will say that the next several weeks is going to be much more interactive and less didactic than these last 2 weeks have been. But it's good groundwork. So questions or comments from these or any of the readings?
Father Gary, this is Fred.
Yep.
I was just going to make a comment regarding the Weber book that you have afforded to us.
Yep.
Yeah, and I had mentioned this, I think, with at church to Peter, and his wife Connie, if my memory serves. For me, I have found that maybe not every page in this book, but certainly the majority of them, those pages are chock full of information, a great deal of quite detailed information. And I'm one who tends to have a pencil that I use to write comments in the margins and so forth, as well, if it's my book and not something that came from the library or whatever. And my book is fairly chock full of comments in the margins and underlining, and my what's that, the highlighter that I tend to use. Yeah. So I'm sure at various points there sometimes I have put a question mark in the column of the. I'm asking what did this say, and perhaps there will be times when we can perhaps together kind of go over some of that if that's agreeable to everyone.
Of course. That's the whole point, is if you've got a question, raise it. You're probably not the only one. So go ahead and raise it. If you've got some historical questions right now, this is the perfect time. Anything else, you can raise it at any point. But yeah, that's what I want, is questions. So, others, while he's looking.
I need my glasses to be able to read. Yeah, it was interesting on in the history chapter, only on like page 7, for example, where the revolution begins. I out in the margin, out to the side, I wrote what? Question mark. It was interesting because under the revolution, about halfway down in that paragraph, there was a sentence that started with Thomas Jefferson even rewrote the Bible, leaving out passages that he thought were no longer relevant or credible. And I said, what? And many of these Southern leaders imagined an American church controlled entirely by the laity, which was certainly different, without bishops or prayer books. And I kind of wondered where that might have come from.
Okay. Two quick comments. One is I would disagree with the author about Jefferson rewriting the Bible in the way that was described. I can come back to that later. But the other point about laity is if you're in a place where a traditional authority figure is gone, who makes the decisions? And without the bishops and all of those kinds of things in the colonies, the congregations got used to making the decisions on their own. So there was this sense of, we don't need these people to come in and tell us how to think. We know how to do that. And that became very characteristic of the Southern colonies, whereas the Northern colonies were still, at least the Anglicans, were still sort of more used to a traditional form of leadership coming down. And so now and I'll just use our experience of Good Shepherd, is Bishop Kim talks about over and over again that churches should be lay-led, the laity taking the lead, that the clergy should be there to support what the laity has decided. Now, that's kind of a marriage between what the Northern colonies and the Southern colonies might have said, is that the clergy are supposed to do all of this kind of stuff. And there's still a big portion of the Episcopal Church who thinks that the clergy rule, rector, that word, my title, comes from the Latin rex, which means king. And, so that's my role, right? I am the king of the parish. Well, no, I'm not. I recognize, and most of the church recognizes, that it's a mutual thing between all of us. And we have our roles to play, our ministries to carry out. So, I don't agree with everything that's in the book, and this is a place where some of this comes up, but there is history, how this sort of spins out. Now, just a brief comment on Jefferson. Some of you who've been in Denver for a while may remember that about 10 years ago, 8 or 10 years ago, the Jefferson Bible came to Denver. His Bible, his original stuff, came to Denver, and it was at the it was at the History Museum of Colorado for some reason. And it was made clear that in the conversations around that and the formation of the United States is that when America was formed, at the end of it, during the Revolutionary War and all of that, there was no other place in the world that had ever developed, no other country that had ever developed that wasn't aligned with the church. There wasn't any other place that was church state that didn't have a religious underpinnings to the development of the country. There we go. I see it on the badges. There we go. This was the first time. And what Jefferson was trying to do was to figure out how to construct a government that was not based religiously. But certainly in the colonies, what everybody had was the Bible, and that was the moral underpinnings of the way that we thought about how things should be ruled, how things should be governed. And so he said, that's fine, but we don't need all of the miracles. That doesn't help us govern. And so when he went through and said, I'm going to take this out and take this out, it wasn't rewriting the Bible. It was like, what are we going to use as the underpinnings of how we're going to establish a democratic, non-theocratic government for this country?
Yeah, that would make sense.
He wasn't trying to rewrite the Bible. He was just trying to take out of it the stuff that was theological to say, this is the moral underpinnings of how we want to govern ourselves.
Okay.
For me, when that Bible came to Denver and I heard these debates about that when it came here, I thought, that makes perfect sense. I get it. So anyway, the Griffiths in his book, he didn't have the benefit of that conversation. So any other questions? It's 8:30.
I'll just say in passing there, Gary, if I inadvertently refer to you as King Gary as opposed to Father Gary, we'll know where that came from.
That's fine, just as long as you bow. So any other questions or comments? Happy to deal with them. Don't want to keep us here much longer, but anything else? As I said, as we move forward, and next week we'll talk about things that are much more pertinent to what we do, because we'll be talking about worship and prayer. History for some people is wonderful and other people is really, really dry, but to know where we came from really helps in my perception, knowing where we are and all of those kinds of things. So that's why we spend so much time on that. But other questions, please. Yeah, everybody's tired. Understood. All right. Well, if you have anything that occurs to you after we sign off, shoot me an email or catch me on Sunday or some other time, and go ahead and ask them. Again, take a look at the Weber and the Griffiths and about worship and prayer. I mean, there's a famous statement. I don't know who made it. When people ask Episcopalians, what do you believe? Really good American question about Christianity. What do you believe? They want to see a statement of faith. And a classic Episcopalian Anglican answer is, come worship with us and you'll see what we believe. That it's not just reading books, thinking, talking, this is what we believe. We say it when we worship, we experience it when we worship, and all of that. And I think that will come out in our conversation next week and in what you look at between now and then. So unless there's anything else, I'll see you next Sunday or next Monday evening, if not before.
Indeed, yes.
Great.
Everybody have
Thanks
a
so
good
much.
week.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.